All right, so welcome everyone to Equitable Building Decarbonization 101. Before we get started, a huge thanks to all of our sponsors who allow us to do what we do, especially our top tier sponsors, Rheem, Mitsubishi, and April Air. And on that note, one thing we wanted to mention about Mitsubishi that was pretty exciting is that they have recently been named one of the most reliable air conditioning systems of 2022, along with many other air source heat pump systems. So what I find interesting is it's not even an air conditioning system, it's a heat pump, and it has been named the most reliable from Consumers Reports. So you can check that out. Make sure to inform your clients of that as well, and we're thankful for their support. All right, so before we get into Equitable Building Decarbonization 101, just again, a reminder, this session is brought to you by the GreenHome Institute. The GreenHome Institute is a nonprofit with a mission to empower people to make healthier and more sustainable choices in the renovation and construction of the places we live. We are a small but mighty team, and I will be your moderator today. My name is Brett Little. I'm the education manager here. This particular course is approved for multiple continuing education units, including all 5 pillars of green in our program and AIALU in this case. So with that, I am super excited to be handing it off to our speakers today, Marnice and Jacob, who are going to tell you a little bit about themselves and the Midwest Decarbonization Coalition. And GreenHome Institute is a proud supporter, member or organization of this group too. So we're excited to share them with you and hope you can learn a little bit more about them and the importance of their work. So Jacob, Marnice, if you want to come on, I'll hand it over to you and you can take it away. So welcome.
Thank you so much for having us. And I'm going to go ahead and prompt up my slides. I am Marnice Jackson, and I'm with the Midwest Building Decarbonization Coalition. And I'll have Jacob introduce himself.
Yeah, I'm Jacob Surfling, the other co-director of the Midwest Building Decarbonization Coalition, and I'm based out of Des Moines, Iowa.
Thank you so much. Okay, so we're here to conduct this training on equitable building decarbonization. I'm in Pontiac, Michigan. Jacob, like he says, in Des Moines, Iowa, and we do have a communication manager, Maggie, who is in Columbus, Ohio. And so with the Midwest Building Decarbonization, we were started back in pre-pandemic 2019, but officially 2020, to develop and implement equitable strategies to achieve zero emissions from the Midwestern building sector by 2050. And there were no organizations or coalitions doing regional strategy on building decarbonization. So we got started in the height of the pandemic, and we have been focusing on structuring the coalition to make it equitable and set foundations where communities can come in and advocate for themselves. We do capacity building, technical assistance, training, of course. And then also we do a lot of policy engagement at the local, state, and federal level. Our regional priority states. This is what we consider Midwest, even though we have regional and state partners. Michigan, Minnesota, Illinois, Wisconsin, Ohio, Missouri, Indiana, and Iowa are our priority states. So, and we have a lot of organizations who are coming from the typical big greens, like our Sierra Clubs, NRDCs, but then we also have our environmental and climate justice advocates, our building implementers, our utility implementers, architect, engineers, contractors, and individuals who's coming to do this work because we see a definite need, because this is a economic, health, and of course a climate issue. And we definitely focus on local, state, and regional work. So of course we invite you to come work alongside us to do this work in this 8-state region. But if you're not in this region, of course, we can always find a place for you to do this work. So I'm gonna pass it on to Jacob. We do a little bit of building decarbonization 101. Not to say that you all need that, but we like to do a refresher as we get into equitable building decarbonization.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Marnice. And like Marnice said, I think some of this may be basic level information for some of the folks that are attending this. But if you're going to talk about doing building decarb work equitably and giving folks in these communities a voice in making that transition on how we power and use our buildings, we need to make it an accessible topic to everybody. So this is sort of the short version of some of the training and education we do with some of our more community-based organization or environmental justice group members coming in that are maybe just learning about building decarb and how it intersects with some of their other goals and concerns. So really just starting off with just defining what decarbonization is, since it's a little bit of a $10 word. So just explaining it as converting all of the energy using activities that we do as humans from using fossil fuel burning to having that energy come from some sort of clean carbon-free source. So explain that typically when you hear talk about decarb in a more technical setting, there's kind of three main buckets that folks are talking about. First being transportation, the second being industrial processes, and then the third, the one that we're mostly working with our members on, commercial and residential buildings. And then there's sort of that fourth bucket that can feed into all three of those, right? Of electric generation, which in some case, you're having that middle step of electricity, but the main source of the energy is still coming from fossil fuels. So then once we've kind of level set on what we mean by decarbonization, then it's explaining, well, what do we specifically mean on building decarbonization? What does that all entail? And we tend to break it down into three main parts for new folks coming in, that aspect of energy efficiency, electrification, and then carbon-free electrical energy generation. Marnice, if you want to go to that next slide. So I think the most effective way to kind of help folks wrap their heads around that we found is sort of framing it as the new 3 R's. I think a lot of us grew up with reduce, reuse, recycle in terms of reducing material pollution and litter. So that's something that's in a lot of our heads already. I've kind of co-opted that for building decarb a little bit. So instead of reduce, reuse, recycle, going with reduce, replace, renewables. So explaining that first pillar of reduce is trying to limit the amount of heating and cooling needed, or shifting that need to more opportune times, but really just bringing down the amount of energy we need to make that a usable, comfortable home or building. And then replace is where we're talking about converting those appliances like stoves, water heaters, and furnaces from ones that are currently utilizing fossil fuels to run on electricity. And then that final step of renewables, kind of standing in for any sort of carbon-free energy there, but just the understanding that once that home is efficient and electrified, needing to ensure that that electricity that's provided to it is also coming from some sort of carbon-free source, whether that be on-site renewables, or ensuring that the utility that electricity is purchased from is procuring their electricity from a carbon-free source. So on top of that, I know Marnice is going to come back to this a little bit more later on in the presentation as well. But just understanding that, on top of that, there's this idea of equitable building decarbonization as well, right? There's a way to do those other 3 aspects in a way that does not address historical injustices or inequity in terms of where folks are starting off in that journey to get to a decarbonized home or business that they work in. So we have worked with our equity working group of coalition members for, oh geez, Marnice, was that like a year-long process, at least, I think, to come to a definition of equitable building decarb that everybody was happy with. But I think it was a very worthwhile exercise to spend that amount of time sitting with it and really tease out all the concerns that folks have with that transition. We always say to folks, especially when we have folks from city or state government that are interested in this, saying like it's worth the time and the pain to like actually go through that process of group developing a definition of equitable building decarb. So the one that we landed on is to remove the hazard of fossil fuel usage in buildings and facilitate access to carbon-free heating, water heating, and cooking, while prioritizing BIPOC or other intersectional identities and empowering poor, low, and moderate income households and underserved communities with clean technologies and infrastructure, including equitable income outcomes in who produces and who benefits from that decarbonization work, and leadership of enterprises and communities that are most impacted by the burdens of energy and environmental injustices. So once we kind of get past the base level of defining of like what we're even talking about, the next obvious question that comes up when you're bringing new folks into this space is, why buildings in all of the realm of climate work or environmental and energy injustice, why start with buildings? So in the Midwest, when we're talking about building decarb, first we're talking about, we spend 90% of our time indoors. The built environment is this huge impact on our lives and where our energy usage comes from. In the Midwest specifically, when you're looking at residential buildings, if you look at the data from Department of Energy and their residential energy survey they do every I think 5 years or so, 72% of the energy consumption from residential buildings is coming from space and water heating, and currently close to 80% of those buildings are using some sort of on-site fossil fuel combustion as their main heating source. So this is like a good way to sort of like get people in that mindset of why those three aspects of building decarb are things that we have to be doing now and be doing in conjunction with each other, right? It doesn't matter if the grid in your state is getting cleaner if the buildings that are using it, the primary usage of energy in those buildings isn't using that clean electricity, right? So just sort of level setting on that of just like the scale of how much energy usage in buildings is actually coming from fossil fuels. Let me see, when I go to that next slide. And then just sort of like getting into it with folks of understanding, how long buildings really last and what the scale of what we're dealing with is. So American Institute of Architects, I think the number they throw around is around 80% of the buildings that we're going to have in 2050, when we know we have to hit net zero and be moving towards negative emissions to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change. 80% of those buildings are already here or under construction. So again, emphasizing to folks like we can't wait for 100% clean grid to start building and retrofitting buildings in a way that's going to be decarbonized. It's not something where you can kind of like pick one or two of those aspects of building decarb to do first, and then we'll come back and hit the second one. We need to do all of them at once just because of how long this stuff lasts. So Maurice, you want to hit like 2 times for me? Okay. Oh, go back one. Perfect. So the green dashed lines there are kind of representing, 2030 is sort of a intermediate milestone that a lot of universities or cities and things like that have hit for certain climate targets. And then obviously 2050 is the big milestone of when we need to hit to net zero. So just sort of explain to folks that, you know, if the median lifespan of your typical gas furnace or AC unit, you know, is somewhere in the realm of 18 to 25 years, if we're replacing a furnace with a gas appliance today, we know it's either going to blow past its ability to positively impact that 2030 emissions target or 2035 emissions target, or you're going to be saddling folks with you know, a costly and unnecessary retrofit before the natural end life of that piece of equipment. And then even if we look at some of those longer goals like 2050, probably got one shot at, you know, replacing a gas unit being installed today before that mark. But again, if the building hasn't been initially designed or retrofitted with, you know, proper panel size or electrical wiring or a building shell that's going to work with a heat pump or other decarbonized appliances, then again, it's either not going to be feasible for that building to have a positive impact on those emissions goals, or you're sticking that homeowner or business owner with costly retrofits that wouldn't be necessary if we're making the right moves with our buildings now. So I think that's kind of like the emphasis that we're trying to put in there of the urgency to move on these things now, when it's not maybe the most obvious, you know, pollution or climate topic for a lot of folks. I'm gonna give me like 4 clicks here, Moniz. Perfect. And then kind of the last piece with that is, again, talking to folks where maybe they have an IOU or a municipal utility that services their community that has goals for hitting, you know, 100% renewables or 24/7 renewables or some other type of emissions reduction target for their electrical grid. And just kind of showing that, you know, we're already in a lot of places at that inflection point in terms of emissions, where between the higher efficiency of air source heat pumps compared to their fossil fuel counterparts and the reductions we've already seen in the emissions grid, that you know, in terms of emissions and pollution, it's already going to be more beneficial to electrify those buildings, and that's only going to get better as we continue moving towards some of those electric grid goals, right? But then when you look at that red line representing those fossil fuel appliances, you know, accounting for, you know, weather changes from year to year, they're basically locked in at the same amount of emissions every year, regardless of what happens with the grid. So just, again, tying it back to that idea that there are these 3 R's of building decarbonization: reduce, replace, and then renewables like carbon-free energy supply, and just re-emphasizing that they are all equally important to each other and need to be done in conjunction.
And Jacob, before we move on, we have 2 questions. Is solar part of any of these statistics? And is sequestering part of these future calculations?
Yeah, so sequestration would not be part of those future statistics, I believe. So this example that I give here, and I hope I'm understanding the question correctly, this was actually based off of the data from Xcel Energy, which is an investor-owned utility that serves Minnesota and parts of Colorado. So this was based off of what their estimated 2005 levels were, and then their targets moving forward. But don't believe that like coal with carbon sequestration was part of that. solar and wind would definitely be a part of their goals there. And just the third question I see in there, we do not currently do any lobbying. We're a 501c3, so most of our work is in terms of educating our members to be able to be advocates in their communities on these topics.
Jacob, I want to go back to the sequestration question. I assume it's a technological or large scale sequestration, but Amani, you can clarify. But let's think about sequestration on the smaller level of, having urban trees and access to that, which has many other benefits. Is that a component of the conversations you have at all?
Not like a huge component. I think definitely we're in favor of folks having trees, and I think in most cases when you're talking about building energy usage and emissions, from our perspective, it's more of a shade in that energy efficiency, reduce the heating and cooling load of the building perspective. Just because I think we know we cannot plant enough trees and plant them fast enough to address the emissions piece. So we need to be doing these other aspects as well.
Right. Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, and then the last piece is, just recognizing that, when you're talking about sort of meeting folks where they're at in terms of building decarb or introducing new folks to the topic, just recognizing that in a lot of cases, that climate and emissions piece probably isn't in a lot of cases the most pressing concern for them, or the most effective way to get folks engaged with these topics. There are definitely other benefits to building decarbonization. We try to emphasize those as well. So we're talking about the health and safety component of building decarbonization as well. I mentioned before, those statistics that most Americans are spending around 90% of our time indoors, and probably preaching to the choir with a GHI audience that indoor air quality has a massive impact on our health. So just talking through some of the studies and statistics of what the impact of gas stoves can be on respiratory health and other health impacts that we're learning about all the time, and kind of those other non-climate related benefits for folks. And then if we go to the next slide, also touching on some of the economic pieces. So, historically, and this is still a challenge for addressing building decarb in the Midwest, but we've had these low natural gas prices and electrical rate structure for folks that have made heating homes with natural gas more economically feasible for folks than electrifying, even with higher efficiency electric equipment. But just trying to get folks thinking about the fact that we don't think that's going to continue to be the piece forever. So already in 2022, we saw these projections, and a lot of that came true for these huge spikes for gas customers on their heating costs. Some of that was tied to international disruption with fossil fuels. A lot of it actually came from extreme cold weather events in the previous 1 or 2 years, right? We remember dealing with the polar vortex and things like that, and helping folks understand what happens with that is that all of a sudden gas utilities have to buy a lot of natural gas very quickly to meet that demand. And now we're in a phase of that volatility and price spike being passed on to consumers. And we're seeing that that's going to continue to be the case moving forward. Meanwhile, on electric rates. They've historically always been much less volatile because they're not as dependent on that one type of fuel. And especially as we bring on more renewables, the projections are that the growth in electric rate prices will be much slower and much less volatile. So when we're talking about equity, there's also this aspect of shielding more customers from those price spikes and that volatility. We know that when those happen, they hit lower income households much harder than higher income households, almost by a degree of 10 times as much the impact on household energy burden for low income households.
Jacob, maybe you're going to touch on this in a little bit, but what you just mentioned kind of reminds me of a new ACEEE report that just came out, and I posted it, where they kind of talk about what it looks like is going to happen is, as other households who can afford to electrify will place a greater burden on those who can't. And yet it puts us in a strange situation, and I'm sure you all know, where if we helped people with restricted income, low income, electrify now, their costs would shoot up right now. Even with gas prices at their high inflation rates, electric prices for many parts of the Midwest are still so expensive. So we would be putting an undue burden on someone right now. Like, maybe you're going to address this later, but I'm just curious, like, what is the way forward here, where we're kind of, it's like, if you act now, you harm somebody, but if you don't act now, they get harmed later.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. It's a real catch-22, and yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit as well, because part of that is like it's exacerbated by a lot of like the current mindset of how we like incentivize folks to make that switch as well. I don't know that there's a lot of like easy answers to that question, but we'll dig into
I wanted
that.
you to solve it all for us today.
Yeah, we're working on it.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks.
Yep. I'm just going to breeze through a couple like Midwest specific things, for building decarb. One is just we're a huge share of U.S. emissions in general. Over a quarter of U.S. CO2 emissions can be traced back to this region of the country. If we were our own country, we'd be number 5 in the world, right between Russia and Japan. And then if we go to the next slide, again, just re-emphasizing when you're talking about building related emissions and building decarb specifically, I mentioned before that close to 80% of residential homes in the Midwest are predominantly fossil fuel for their space heating. On the water heating side, it's around like 65-66% of homes have fossil fuel as their predominant energy source, and that's much higher than the rest of the country on both of those. And then if we go to the next slide, on top of that, we have a longer and more intense heating season than the rest of the country as well. So which I think ties back to that 72% of residential energy use in the Midwest going to space and water heating. So we have more demand for heating energy than the rest of the country, and we're meeting more of that demand with fossil fuels than the rest of the country. So kind of a uniquely Midwest concern as far as meeting climate goals is building decarbonization. So touching on some of those challenges that Brett brought up, one, again, especially when we're talking about doing equitable building decarb work, is that we're just not starting from equal footing with making this transition. And a lot of times the programs that we have to encourage decarbonization or electrification just don't reflect that, right? So this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but just, you know, a few numbers that we usually throw at folks to kind of make that point of emphasis when we're bringing them into the coalition. You know, Midwest BDC states range from, you know, 35 to 43 affordable units per 100 extremely low income renters. We have these extremely high rates of energy insecurity, and you can see the numbers that we quote there from 2015. We know that the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated many of those numbers to an extreme degree. And we also know that, you know, Black or brown households during the COVID-19 pandemic were around 2 times more likely to experience utility shutoffs. So, you know, before we even get to talking about, you know, decarbonized housing or businesses, you know, we're recognizing that, you know, we just have too much substandard or non-existent shelter or access to energy before we even start into the topic. So that's definitely a major challenge in doing this work, you know, right from the word go. And then on top of it, you know, we have challenges, you know, that, you know, from the way that our utilities, which are the way that most people are probably going to have access to electrical energy and how they operate. You know, one is with the way that utilities have traditionally done energy efficiency programs, which I think a lot of people, you know, gravitate towards as a potential tool for doing building decarbonization, but they're just not really built to do what we need them to do. It's a little like trying to drive in screws with a hammer because that's what you have available. So part of that is a lot of them have rules around fuel switching that were, you know, reflective of the initial role of those programs was to prevent having to build new power plants and pass those costs on to members. But what it means now is that a lot of them will not allow for, you know, giving folks incentives to move from natural gas appliances to a heat pump or other can you go back, Bernice? Or other you know, high efficiency electric appliances. So, you know, I talked about how, you know, if you're replacing a gas appliance now, it's going to last for 20 years and or more, you know, a lot of folks are probably have more financial incentive to put in those high efficiency natural gas appliances than the electric one. That's part of it. And then the other piece is that, you know, because they are governed by these cost effectiveness rules, you know, utilities are incentivized to go ahead and you know, do programs that are pay to play or kind of going after the lowest hanging fruit that they can to demonstrate that they're reducing energy usage. And the result of that, kind of touching on the question Brett had before, is that they tend to make it easier for, you know, higher income or wealthier households to make these transitions and not be as accessible to folks who need additional help to make that transition feasible. So, you know, a lot of cases, unless you're like explicitly carved out for low income households, utilities aren't offering programs that are going to cover, you know, the additional wiring or panel upgrade work to put in a air source heat pump or something like that. And that means that a lot of folks who are most at risk of, you know, the negative economic aspects of this transition are the least able to take advantage of incentives from their utilities to make any sort of switch. And then we talked about the rate structure as well, and just, you know, in a lot of cases, especially in the Midwest, there's a lack of electric or all electric heating rates that would be competitive with natural gas heating. So, that's part of, I think, the organizing and advocacy challenge around building decarb as well, is, you know, being involved in that regulatory space to, you know, make sure that utilities are offering electric heating rates that can be competitive with fossil heating. Okay, go ahead. You know, additional challenges in terms of split incentives, and this is a huge one when you're talking about doing building decarb work equitably. You know, obviously, huge portion of folks in the region are renters. They don't own the building that they are living in. And so, you know, the person who would ultimately be responsible for the upfront costs of doing some of these building upgrades is not the same person that is seeing the benefit of reduced utility bills or health and comfort and things like that. So always a challenge to get developers and landlords to the table and kind of force their hand a little bit on making some of these upgrades when they don't necessarily see it as something that's going to lead to an increase of income from the property for them. And then in terms of, you know, workforce and contractors, you know, I'm sure this audience, you know, is well aware that there's just a general shortage of skilled technicians in the HVAC and electrical spaces already. It's an aging workforce that's already facing a crunch as it is. And then on top of that, you know, there's a lack of familiarity or operating on outdated assumptions about the state of technology and how well it works in the upper Midwest. You know, before I came to this role in the coalition, I was a licensed professional engineer in Iowa for around a decade. And, you know, I remember coming out of school and, you know, being told flat out that unless there was no way to run a gas service out to the project site, that you didn't design around heat pumps. So, you know, that's, I think, the mindset that a lot of contractors are working on. And certainly we hear a lot of anecdotal stories about folks who had done their homework and wanted a heat pump and really struggled to find a contractor that was willing to do it, or didn't try to talk them out of it, you know, when they came out to the home. And then on top of that, just, you know, equity gaps in terms of what that workforce looks like compared to the overall labor market. I think if I remember that E2 study correctly, it's around, you know, 3% Black in the clean energy workforce compared to 8% of the total US workforce. And then if you dig deeper on top of that, you'll find that a lot of the Black or brown people that are able to enter those fields are kind of cool at the entry level, and they're not advancing up into, you know, construction management or design rules and things like that. So, you know, definitely a challenge, but, you know, maybe an opportunity there as we recognize that we need to bring more people in general into the field to make sure that there's an emphasis on those communities. So I'm going to hand it over to Marnice to kind of connect that even more deeply into some of the equity and justice topics that we talk with our coalition members about as well.
Jacob, did you want to take the questions in the chat before I proceed on?
I can, I'll do some typed answers in the chat, and then we can kind of come back at the end. How about that? Because I know we're running up on time.
All right. Okay, so now we're going to get into the Equitable Building Decarbonization 101. And for those who are in the chat, could you give me one word of what you think equity is? Or what do you think the definition of equity is? All right, let's see what's going on in the chats. All right, they're coming in. fairness, fair. Okay. All right. So equal, removing barriers. Thank you. Okay, so according to the EPA, we're going to go back to their definition of environmental equity. It is a basic human right. Environmental justice is the act of protecting that right, and environmental justice involves the actions and activism necessary to highlight inequities and level the playing field. And this means proper oversight and review of federal agencies, proper permitting and licensing for companies, buildings, and to make sure that these things are not emitted into our air. And so with equity, we'll go back to equality. Equality aims to ensure that everyone gets the same in order to enjoy full, healthy lives. But on the other hand, equity involves trying to understand and give people what they need to enjoy healthy lives. And sometimes these terms are used interchangeably, which causes confusion. And so equality aims to protect fairness and justice, but it also only works if everyone starts from the same place and needs the same things. This exists in a thin layer. However, justice is collectively responsibility of a free and just society to ensure that civil and human rights are preserved and protected for each individual, regardless of race, sexual orientation, ethnicity, class, physical, mental ability, and age. So this is also looking at equity in an intersectional view. And to move on from this, we want to take down that fence so everyone can get into the game and be able to remove those systematic barriers, the fence, where we all can address these issues. So with equitable building decarbonization, and I want to go back to that. With building decarbonization, it means converting appliances like water heaters, furnaces, and from fossil fuels to clean carbon-free electricity. So with equitable building decarbonization is an effort to incorporate racial equity and energy democracy into the process and policies being proposed. And the goal to electrify buildings is the same. The key distinction is the people, the process, and the methods to achieve that goal, which will build community-engaged solutions to clean our air, create healthier homes, create good jobs that we all want, prevent community displacement like redlining, and empower workers. And so according to Policy Link, equity is the just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. And sustainability without equity is sustaining these inequities. So equity is not a separate goal from decarbonization. In fact, we believe that without centering the needs of the most marginalized people and communities, our efforts to achieve a carbon-free buildings will be counterproductive. And so as stated before, we at the coalition created our own equity definition, which gives the members a stake within the coalition. And also, when you are having people and members of a community make decisions on what something looks like, they keep coming back. And so equity, from where we sit, is holding ourselves and one another accountable to inclusion in a society in which all can participate, prosper, have value, and reach their full potential. We recognize and work to dismantle injustices, systems, and barriers that prevent some from achieving this goal. And so just to step back, we have to connect the dots of environmental and climate justice and how this fits into where we are doing this work of building decarbonization. And so environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So the implementation is the key part, because we can't have a just environment if we are implementing these policies without the people who are impacted from these environmental issues at the table. And climate justice is a term used for framing global warming as an ethical and political issue rather than one that is purely environmental or physical in nature. And then with energy justice, it's one of the central global issues of our time with profound implications for health and welfare, freedom and security, equity and due process, and technology development and implementation. So with all that, global warming refers only to Earth rising surface temperatures, while climate change includes warming and the side effects of warming, like melting glaciers, heavier storms, and frequent drought, which we all have been experiencing. So due to climate change, we're going to experience displacement of people due to these heavy storms and disasters, or even possibly those man-made disasters of utility shutoffs because of unreliable grid. People may experience redlining, gentrification, housing problems, lack of political power, as we see in our different legislators, and then emergency management intervention and takeover. So racial justice is an environmental justice issue. This is nothing new. Pre-1980s, environmental justice and racism was coined due to toxic pollutants being dumped in a Black, brown, and low-income city in North Carolina. But this is no different. We have states in the United States have been plagued by these polluting facilities in the United States, as we see Detroit, Los Angeles, and Louisiana, just to get some demographics. So when we're thinking about building decarbonization, we have to think about the driver of these issues, and these are our utility providers who put these polluting facilities in low-income and Black communities. And so the main driver of this is capitalism, which is a political economic system based on exploitation that has caused the climate crisis. The government plays a supportive role to the small percentage of people who own and control these corporations and make the most decisions and decide who owns the property. And so these fossil fuels, these companies are hurting our respective lands. And the only way to get past this, to look at this as an intersectional, that climate justice, environmental justice, energy justice is all related to buildings, of where we spend majority of our time indoors. And so with that being said, Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color nationwide experience disproportionately poor air quality. This is especially true in states like Michigan, where non-white communities face some of the most disproportionate matter burning. Furthermore, a comprehensive review found that 42% of children live in a home with gas. As you can see on the screen, that gas is one of the main drivers of poor indoor air quality, that 42% of increased risk of asthma these are children who are living in a home with gas. And so by switching to electric appliances, occupants can breathe healthier air and improve outdoor air quality as well. And these upgrades are especially needed in communities that face the worst pollution. And with building decarbonization, it offers an opportunity to better the health and the comfort of our homes. However, without prioritizing equity, decarbonization initiatives risk only improving indoor air quality for families that can afford electric appliances and building upgrades. So we need to, of course, quickly decarbonize buildings fast, but we have to do this in an equitable way. Unfortunately, we can't do this with the same practices. The foundation our United States have been founded on, with the displacement of Indigenous peoples and the enslavement of Africans and African Americans. So this is why having community people involved within the building decarbonization space, because these policies are these policies are the same practices our country has been built on. So advancing building electrification policies addresses both the climate and immediate public health risks. which will support in the end vulnerable communities if we have equitable policies. So while building electrification has been promising benefits for residents, it must be pursued equitably, ensuring that environmental and social justice communities can benefit rather than being left behind with polluting and increasing expensive gas appliances. So, and then also having access to energy efficiency options, which will help reduce monthly energy bills. So, with that being said, we in the Midwest, for example, have 31 to 45 available affordable rental homes per 100 extremely low income renters. And so with building decarbonization, we have to look at this intersectionally, that this is a health issue, and we have to address the energy burden of high utility rates, which ultimately we would have to avoid displacement risk because of the climate issues. And then look at the big goal of creating these green jobs that we all want and make sure that they are sustainable. But also doing that, we have to get rid of these false solutions that are in demand right now, such as natural gas, hydrogen, which is also in demand. And then also thinking about how we look at net zero as a solution. It's just not meeting the mark for where we're trying to go as a bigger movement. And net zero allows communities who are in these low income or marginalized communities to continue to be polluted on and dumped on. So we have to look at this bigger than net zero, which is a goal, but it's not the big goal that we should be aiming for. And so to have these equitable solutions, we must assess the community needs. This should include understanding the barriers from preventing community members from electrifying their homes. We have to take knowledge of these levels of what they need, their wishes and their concerns. So you have to do a basic level of community organizing. You must establish community-led decision-making processes, rich engagement and input from communities, strengthen the overall program design of whatever you're trying to do for building decarbonization. So creating a partnership of community-based organizations in this decision-making process will help with the needs and prioritize them. And then develop metrics and a plan for tracking. Now, everything is not going to get solved overnight. That's why you have metrics and planning. You use this to create developing this, which will also help you build off of what you're trying to achieve. And then it's just basic goal setting, and then ensure funding program leveraging. So this is really huge because current low income energy programs often fail to deliver maximum benefits to all qualifying households due to the short and unpredictable funding cycles. Yes, everyone's talking about IRA and funding coming down to local communities, but we have to reassure that these funds actually get to these communities, but then also that these program designs reaches qualifying customers, and that there's coordination between the people who are getting this funding, but then also just funding in general. When we have weatherization programs or energy efficiency programs, we have to make sure that these are also designed by community members, community organizations, people who are advocates for clean energy options, and also advocates for low income and communities of color. If you're not that, I mean, that's fine, but there's, like I said, a role for everyone to advocate for communities who are suffering the most. And then you go back to improve your outcomes using tracking and metrics planning. Like I said, things are not going to be perfect overnight when you're doing these programs, but when you create these different foundations for a just transition, then once again, you get buy-in from the community and they will become advocates and activists and then hold people accountable to improve these processes. So some other solutions, of course, we have to eliminate this reliance on fossil fuels quickly. We have to kind of continue fighting to close down these power plants and power pipelines, passing laws, which is a huge effort. And if you have the bandwidth and the capacity to do so, we have to work at doing those. Of course, promote energy efficiency more than solar, honestly, because energy efficiency is more accessible. Yes, solar is sexy and awesome, but energy efficiency is very accessible to communities. And then advocating at the PSP Public Service Commission, because they most of the time hold the power and dictate what your local or state utility can do and cannot do. So that's where a lot of voices need to be heard within the work that we do. Lastly, I wanted to talk about white supremacy culture and how it shows up. If you're not familiar with these characteristics, it's a lot, but the main one that shows up within the movement that we all work in is the sense of urgency. We want to do it. We want to do it now. And this culture is very damaging to everyone, the way we think, because we have been indoctrinated into these different characteristics and ideologies since the establishment of the United States of America. So everyone has dealt with something like this, even myself. So I will put the link in the chat where you can find these, and you can do some internal work on yourself before you do organizational work. But this also is just good for teaching your children about just the values and how to do the work when they go into their respective fields. So the main one that shows up in our movement, once again, is the sense of urgency, because we want to get it done. We want to get it now. We have IRA funding. We have to hold people accountable before it goes away, because we're in a new political cycle. But we have to make sure that we're being realistic, because just because we want something now doesn't mean that we have to rush to do it. So it does take balance. And I know we're at the tipping point or past the tipping point for climate, for all these climate disasters. However, communities of color, we don't operate like that. We have other issues outside of the climate crisis that we deal with that is intersectional with the climate movement. So I would say just take a step back and be thoughtful about your decisions when you're putting your plans together and when you're advocating for cleaner energy solutions. So make sure you set realistic goals. And then, you know, the climate crisis is not just about the environment, it's about the crisis of human rights, of justice, and a political will. And so we are built on colonial, racist, and patriarchal systems of oppression. And climate change has been fueled by those different systems. And so the only way to dismantle them is to switch from an extractive economy. That's what our climate crisis is built on, an extractive economy, and move to more of a regenerative economy, where everyone is a part of the process. Everyone is visualizing what this economy will look like in the future, and it's not perpetuating these same cycles. And so just transition initiatives are shifting from dirty energy to energy democracy, where everyone is a part of in deciding where their energy comes from. And so lastly, we have to make sure that we ignore, inform, consult, involve, and collaborate, defer. So this is a process of the spectrum of community engagement, which is a part of equity, and that the process is key. So you have to make sure that if you're ignoring the marginalized communities, this is a spectrum, right? You have to decide where you're at on this spectrum. So if you're at 0, the goal is to get to definitely collaborating, but also lastly, to defer to community ownership. And that's what equity looks like. So here are some references to get to equitable building decarbonization. We had the NAACP, Centering Equity in the Sustainable Building Sector, and then also the Green Lining Institute. And I could put the resources in the chat on if you want to move towards more equitable building decarbonization. So our coalition is open. Of course, you can join us. There's no membership fee. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and we do have a YouTube page. You, of course, can contact me or Jacob. We have a lot of different working groups, so we do host orientations. And you can be an organizational member or an individual member. And before we go, I might do it on time, we would like to show you an example of what building decarbonization looks like for one of our grantees, Pembroke Energy Efficiency Pilot. Our grantees, the Pembroke Community Corporation, they are in Kankakee County, Illinois, and they did an electrification pilot project, and this is a historic Black community. So this is what, in our mind, equitable building decarbonization looks like, and it starts by demonstrating and having community ownership. Can everybody hear that? Okay, great. I'll keep it going.
The scenery, the pleasant quietness is my retreat.
It is a wonderful place in the world, and its treasures and strengths are just unknown to most of the people in the area.
This is as much peace as one can find. And it's the best place that I found that I could possibly be. And I'm not going anywhere.
I was raised in Chicago, Illinois, but somewhere in the back of my mind, I wanted to live in the country. So I came out here, and sure enough, it was like the country, and I fell in love with it. It's a whole new, different life. It's nice and quiet and peaceful.
The unity out here is far more than I've had. It's a place where people put an effort toward being able to understand one another.
Pembroke has stayed the same. There's a lot of stores around here. We have to go out to the stores. There's no buses out here. You know, you have to, this is a country. This is truly the country.
My mother was born and raised in Pembroke. Coming to visit every weekend as a kid, part of me, had a lot of questions like, how can people survive out here, with all the lack of resources, and how do people really make it? Even as an adult, I still see a lot hasn't changed.
Bottled gas heats my home. The price of the bottled gas for the house is extreme.
I actually heat by electricity, propane, and the wood stove. If you look around my home, you'll see the smoke from the wood burning. That's not so good. And the propane, that's getting expensive. And when you're out, you're out. I don't like that. This is a retreat. I'm retired. I want to rest and relax and not have anything to worry about.
The goal of the P program is to show a possible and feasible and practical way of transforming homes in economically challenged rural communities such as Pembroke to get off fossil fuel heating and cooling systems.
Historically, this community has been taken advantage of, a lot of deceit, a lot of manipulation. So approaching homeowners with this idea, with this new technology and all these new upgrades, one would think that, hey, it'd be an easy buy-in, but it wasn't. We really had to make it very personal with each of the homeowners.
As Americans, we're groomed that heating is done with gas and with a big ball of fire, and it's not like that anymore. So we're trying to change people's mindsets that gas is the best way to heat a home. It's been proven now that it's not the best way. Electricity is the best way to do it and the most sustainable way to do it.
In each of the 4 homes that we're working in, we are eliminating gas-fired furnaces, and gas-fired hot water heaters, and installing new Mitsubishi heat pumps that both heat and cool, and putting in new electric hot water heaters.
Pete, it's fantastic because all the things that I'm getting done around this house, I would never have been able to do it, on my own. The cost, never. So this is truly a blessing. Number one, I have new windows. You look out now and I can see the trees and the sky and all clearly, because before I had plastic over the windows because there was air coming through. I have a heating and an air conditioning system in all of my rooms. So I don't have to burn my wood stove anymore, and I don't have to use propane. I'm having a new stove because of my old stove is running too much electricity, and that's a blessing.
Since I don't do this myself, to have someone come in and actually do it for me is a fantastic way of sharing life. Everything that I've seen done to this point, I've been very satisfied with.
The idea is to create a good template of success of this program and duplicate it.
I see a vision where we become leading role models for other rural communities.
The next 5 years, I would be 83 years old. And I would like to sit on my porch with my locks down to my knees, thinking about what a wonderful place this is, how people have come together and are working together, and how we don't need to have a lot of stores or industry out here. We just need to have the basic things out here.
My biggest vision is to change to shift the paradigm of the way people think about this community. Don't count Pembroke out, why not Pembroke? I really want to take the success of this program and illustrate it to the stakeholders and other potential funders that, hey, this can really work. It can really work, but more importantly, let the community know that you don't have to miss out. You all deserve it too.
All right, and so I guess we could take questions now. Brett, we can defer back to you. I mean, I know we're on time.
No, that's okay. This is great. And Marnise, are you able to stick around with us for a little bit, or do you have to get going?
I did, but I can do two things at once.
All right. All right. Fair enough. Well, as you can see, there's a lot of questions, a lot of comments. I just, wanted to mention, I really appreciate you bringing up the rushing and the being in a hurry aspect. I know certainly it's something that I struggle with as an individual. So it was I really appreciate getting that insight, and I'm looking forward to that additional link that you'll send out, and I'll provide it to folks on the recording too, so I can learn more. On that note though, how do you square that with the fact that we're sort of forced to rush, in that you've got the rebate programs? They're always, the utilities are like, hurry up, they're running out, oh, they're out, right? So they sort of force you to rush to get their programs, especially if you're trying to get those funds to communities who definitely don't get them. And then as far as the IRA rebates go, we're getting told, time and time again that this is very little amount of money, very small pool. And it's so concerning to me that all federal programs have always went to people who really didn't need those funds as much as others. And now we're being said it's very limited, hurry up and get it. So it's like, I'm struggling, because it's like, we've got to rush, but you're saying and making good points about how rushing also leaves people out also. So how do you square the two?
Yeah, it's tough, right? I think as we, that's part of, I think, why we exist as a coalition, that you can, at least if we are collaborating and working together, you can mitigate a little bit of that folks getting railroaded by a very, rushed, fast-paced process. There are some opportunities for, public input and engagement and things with these programs, both at the federal and the state level. But, a lot of times we're gonna announce it on Monday and the deadline is Friday, and here's the 20-page document explaining what we're asking for. So I think, we're trying to do two things with that, right? We're both trying to make that as accessible as we can to folks who, are normal people who aren't doing this every day, right? And then also, as we're engaging with those processes, just like being as loud as we can, saying like, this is not an acceptable way to run this process, right? Like this needs to change as you're moving forward with it. Because I think there are a lot of, even when you have, some of these programs, from the IRA or things that the states are doing that are well-intentioned, they miss a lot of what's happening on the ground when they're trying to move fast. There were some questions in the chat about the PEEP program that we were watching the video on, and there's just like a lot of nuance on there that I think even we missed going in when we were initially supporting that project, right? I think we underestimated how poor the condition of a lot of the homes that we were going to be working on was. I think if you talk to Lee, I think that on average for the 4 homes that they did as part of that project, it was an average of 40 to 50,000 to even like get them to the point of this home is now ready to have a heat pump put in place and not negatively impact this person, because they had so many moisture and structural and other issues that had to get dealt with first. And I think that's part of the danger in moving fast, right? Like we have when you focus on, well, we need to get emissions down as fast as possible, I think there's an inclination to just, well, we just got to get heat pumps in as many homes as we can. And sometimes it's really doing a real like disservice to folks if you're not going to make the investment in some of those other issues as well.
Yeah, well, thank you for responding to that and giving some examples and some ideas. Now, speaking about the coalition in general, taking a step back here, what about folks who find themselves out of the Midwest, and that's a tragedy, you should come here, but they're like, hey, I want to join something like this. Is there a national coalition? Are there other regional coalition partners that are similar that you're aware of?
I think unfortunately we are a little unique in terms of who we engage with, right? Like certainly I think there are national coordinating calls and things like that of like the big national or regional green and energy groups and stuff that work in this space. But for better or worse, I think we're kind of like inventing the bike as we ride it, in terms of like trying to connect that with community-based organizations that want to get involved with this stuff.
Yeah,
but I think we're happy to like share like hard lessons we learned with anybody who wants to hear about it, and hopefully it doesn't have to be as difficult for other folks as it has been for us at times.
Yeah, no, you've definitely shared a lot of your process. And so another question that came up earlier was specific to whether HUD was involved in your group, but I want to expand that question to just say, are there government agencies all the way from the top, is the president one? Is he on the email list? All the way down to the very local level, do you have government agencies engaged?
Yeah, so not directly as members, typically. We have certainly had folks from, like municipal or state government that have, attended a training or an event or something like that we've put on. I think more our interaction is trying to like facilitate those relationships between our coalition members and those folks. That's a lot of what our different working groups have done. Because I think on both ends, right, there's like a struggle there of like trying to identify who you should be talking to, or what the best way to like make contact with that is. I think for as much as like community-based organizations struggle with like making those connections with their state government, I think we also hear from like state energy office staff that they're like, we want to do a better job doing this outreach. We like don't really know where to start. So I think it's like helpful both ways, where we can like kind of come in with a group of folks and say like, we have this group of 10 people in your state that are, represent different organizations and have, interest and concerns around this program. We'll make it easy for you and put that conversation together so you don't have to seek them out.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And another question. Could you just, as part of your one of the descriptors you had on there, BIPOC, BIPOC, just for everyone's sake who doesn't know, what does that mean?
Black, Indigenous, people of color.
Thank you. And that was part of your equitable, your decarbonization statement, correct? As far as communities. Yeah. Okay. I wrote it down, like I know, but I wrote it down on a note just so in case someone else doesn't know. So,
and it's cool to say that, that's a standing practice for a lot of organizations, just for keeping us on the same page. But a lot of us don't like to be grouped as, so just FYI.
Yeah. I appreciate that. And it makes me think about, like what you were saying, going into the specific communities, slowing down and getting engagement to make sure you're making the right decisions there. And I was wondering how that squared with metrics. You were mentioning, coming up with some measurable goals. Is that something you all help facilitate? Because and I'll just use an example, and I think we spoke to it a little bit, like, I'm looking at like a particular weatherization program, right? Asking them what the demographics are of the people they served. And of course they know their income, but they couldn't tell me anything else. And so I was like shocked, like, how do you know who you're helping and who you aren't helping if you aren't collecting this information? So I'm just using that as an example, but is that something you all help with to give specific advice on how you can make sure you're being effective?
I think the most specific advice we give, and now I'm thinking specifically like when we have helped our coalition members comment on like how different federal or state programs are getting implemented, is that the community that you are saying you are going to go serve should have a hand in determining what those metrics are, and what is going to be most valuable to them. I talked about that a little bit when we're talking about like some of the climate related benefits of building decarb, right?
Right.
I think that's been illuminating, as we work with our members to set the priorities for the coalition and things like that, to come in and say like, well, it's going to benefit you to reduce air pollution or emissions in the community. So here's the metrics that we're going to use to do that. It might not necessarily be like the most top of mind thing for that community, and there should be a process to allow them to have input on that, right? It may be more important for that community to have metrics based around, energy burden first, and the emissions are, a secondary concern, right? It may be more important to have metrics around, securing some of the economic and jobs benefits of these different programs in the community that they're serving, and there need to be metrics around that. But I think, ultimately you don't know that unless you're actually including that in part of your process to have that conversation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, this is fantastic information. I really appreciate both of you showing up and taking some time to do this and explaining these important important things we need to be working on while we're trying to electrify everything and reduce emissions, and making sure everyone is getting involved and gets access. So again, just can you remind us, where can people go to learn more, reach out if they want to contact you?
Yeah, definitely. It's midwestdecarb.org is the website. There's information there about becoming a member of the coalition, and kind of what our requirements are for that. You can see the calendar of our upcoming trainings or events and things like that, as well as recordings of other sessions we've done in the past, and all of that. So that's probably the best way. And I think we're at Midwest BDC on Twitter and Facebook and all of that. So definitely check that out. And I see Marnie's put our emails in there as well. We're always happy to answer those side emails as well about any specific questions. I think it's obviously such a big topic that intersects with so many things. So sometimes, it's helpful to have that conversation. Like, where do I actually plug in on this? Like, where makes sense for me to loop this into what we're working on.
Yeah, and I will say I've been in the group listserv, and I appreciate everything everybody shares there. And for those of you who want to join that, I think people get plugged into that too, and learn what's going on. So Jacob, Marnice, Midwest Building Decarbonization, thank you so much for your time. Look forward to interacting with you all more, and take care, everyone. Have a great rest of your week. Thank you.
Be sure to check out all of our courses available online that you can watch anytime and anywhere to pick up your CEUs. Before you go, make sure to subscribe to us on YouTube to get weekly updates and stay up to date on green building science courses, webinars, and home tours. Thanks again.